whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive. If you want to understand why Europe spent the next 1,000 years chasing the idea of empire, and why popes and kings would later clash over who outranked whom, you can trace it back to one ceremony that looked peaceful on the people's leader, surface. No battlefield, no grand conquest announced to the crowd, just a crown, a church, and a decision that quietly rewired the meaning of legitimacy. From that moment on, power in the West would carry a permanent question mark. Does authority come from the sword that can take it, or the altar that can bless it? Because once an emperor is made in public, every ruler after him has to answer the same dangerous question: who gets to decide who is rightful? It is the year 800, and Rome feels both holy and uneasy at the same time. You can sense it in the way people speak in low voices, in the way guards watch the alleys, in the way pilgrims hurry toward the churches before dusk. This is not the Rome of the Caesars anymore. It is a city of memories layered over broken stone, a city that still carries the weight of the word Rome even when its streets no longer command an empire. On Christmas Day, people press toward Old St. Peter's Basilica, a church built over an ancient Christian burial ground. Lamps burn with a soft, trembling light. The smell of wax and incense hangs in the air. Priests chant, footsteps echo. And among the crowd is the most powerful ruler in the Western lands, a man whose name already travels faster than any messenger can ride. Charles, King of the Franks. Later generations will call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Before we walk deeper into this story, let me slip in a simple invitation that fits the moment. If you enjoy listening to history told like a living journey, full of real people, turning points, and consequences, then subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories like this ahead, and it's better to travel through the past together than alone. Now, back inside the Basilica. During the Mass, a crown is brought forward. The Pope, Leo III, places it on Charles's head and proclaims him emperor. In one instant, a Frankish king is linked to the ancient title that once belonged to Augustus and Constantine. For many in the Western lands, it sounds like a promise. The world will be ordered again. For others, it sounds like a provocation. There is already an emperor in Constantinople, in the Eastern Roman Empire, and Rome has just declared a rival. That is why the coronation of 800 is not just a dramatic ceremony. It is a political earthquake that keeps rumbling for centuries. It raises a question that medieval Europe will never fully settle. Who has the right to make an emperor? To understand how a man from the northern forests of Europe ends up crowned in Rome, you have to picture the world he inherited. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, power did not vanish, but it changed shape. Instead of one central government controlling everything, authority became local. Strong families ruled regions. Towns defended themselves. Warriors offered protection in exchange for land and loyalty. The church, with its bishops, monasteries, and liturgy, became one of the few institutions that could still connect distant communities through shared beliefs and shared practices. By the time Charles is born, the Frankish world is already rising. His family did not begin as imperial royalty. They began as the kind of people who understood how power really worked in a fractured landscape, through armies, alliances, land, and the careful use of religion as legitimacy. His grandfather, Charles Martel, was famous as a hard military leader, a man who could mobilize warriors quickly and keep them disciplined. His father, Pepin the Short, takes a step that changes European politics. With support from important church figures, he replaces an older royal line that had become symbolic and weak. Pepin becomes king not because everyone agrees he has the purest bloodline, but because he has the power to rule and the blessing to justify it. Charles grows up in that atmosphere. It is an atmosphere where a ruler is expected to lead personally, not to hide behind officials. It is also an atmosphere where a ruler must reward loyalty, punish rebellion, and never appear weak. Even the way you travel matters. Your presence is your authority. You do not simply govern, you show yourself. You judge disputes, you distribute gifts, and you remind everyone that the center still exists. When Charles takes power in 768, he does not step into a peaceful kingdom. He steps into a realm that is expanding, but not yet fully settled. He faces neighbors who are rivals, raiders, or potential allies. He faces internal tensions among nobles who are loyal as long as loyalty pays. He faces a church that wants protection and order, but also wants independence and moral authority. And above all, he faces a basic truth of early medieval politics. If you stop pushing, someone else pushes into you. Over the next decades, Charles becomes the most relentless political machine in Western Europe. He campaigns again and again. He negotiates, he returns, he pressures, he rebuilds. He does not rely on one glorious victory. He relies on staying in the fight season after season until his opponents are exhausted or absorbed. One of his earliest major moves is into Italy. The Lombards, based in northern Italy, had long been a threat and a rival in the peninsula. For the papacy, Lombard pressure was a constant fear. By moving against Lombard power, Charles gains territory, and more importantly, he becomes the protector the Pope desperately needs. This relationship between the Frankish ruler and the papacy grows deeper and more strategic. It is not simply friendship. It is a bargain. Protection in exchange for legitimacy, and legitimacy in exchange for a stronger hand in building order. But the most grinding conflict of his reign is not in Italy. It is in Saxony, in the lands northeast of the Frankish heartland. Saxony is not a neat kingdom with one capital and one king who can surrender. It is a region of communities, leaders, sacred sites, and shifting loyalties. The Saxons do not see themselves as part of Charles's order. They fight, they submit, they rebel, they submit again, and the cycle repeats. These Saxon Wars last for decades, and they reveal both Charles's strength and his harshness. He believes unity is necessary. He believes a unified Christian realm is part of his calling as a ruler, and he is willing to use force to achieve it. There is no point pretending this is gentle history. Campaigns destroy crops, hostages are taken, sacred sites are targeted, forced oaths are demanded. In at least one notorious episode, after a rebellion, large numbers of Saxon prisoners are executed. Modern listeners might recoil, and they should, because mass killing is not a different times detail that becomes morally harmless. At the same time, understanding the era means seeing how rulers thought. Charles believed that repeated rebellion threatened the stability of everything he was building, and he responded with methods meant to terrify and deter. To the southeast, Charles fights the Avars, a powerful people who had built a steppe empire in the region of the Carpathian Basin. These campaigns matter because they reduce a dangerous rival and because they release enormous wealth. In the early Middle Ages, treasure is not just personal luxury, it is political glue. A ruler who can redistribute wealth can bind nobles to him. He can fund churches. He can build palaces. He can reward warriors. Plunder becomes policy. To the south, there is the border with Muslim-ruled Iberia. Charles does not conquer Spain, despite later heroic legends. He attempts a campaign and faces disaster during a retreat. That ambush later becomes the seed of a famous medieval epic, the Song of Roland, which turns a messy real event into a story of noble sacrifice. Here you can see how history becomes myth. The real retreat shows limits and danger. The later poem shows ideals and identity. Both shape memory. So why did Charles win so often? It is tempting to point to a single invention, a magical piece of technology that explains everything. People sometimes talk about the stirrup as if it arrives at exactly the right moment to give Frankish cavalry a decisive advantage. But history is rarely that neat. Frankish armies did use mounted warriors, and equipment matters. But the deeper reason Charles expands is simpler and more human. His system can keep showing up. Year after year, he can gather men. He can move supplies. He can build bridges. He can force engagements. He can return the next season. This relentlessness wears down opponents who cannot match the same pace of mobilization. Persistence becomes a strategic weapon. Yet conquest is only half the story. Charlemagne matters because he tries to govern what he conquers, not merely loot it. Imagine the challenge. His realm stretches across different languages, customs, and legal traditions. Travel is slow, messages can take weeks. Local lords have their own power bases. In such a world, the center can easily collapse into a loose collection of semi-independent regions. If Charles wants something that resembles an empire, he needs mechanisms that pull the edges toward the center. He does not invent modern bureaucracy, but he strengthens the tools available. Counts and dukes govern regions. Bishops and abbots manage large estates, and because they can read and write more often than lay nobles, they become administrators as well as spiritual leaders. Assemblies bring elites together for decisions and oaths. Charlemagne uses these pieces, but he also pushes them toward a more organized system. One of his most important methods is the use of royal envoys, often called missi dominici, the Lord's messengers. These are officials sent to different parts of the realm to inspect, to hear grievances, to enforce rulings, and to remind everyone that the ruler's authority is not merely a rumor from far away. Typically they are sent in pairs, often a lay noble and a churchman, so that neither side controls the process alone. In practice, this system is uneven. Roads are bad. Local power can resist. Some envoys are honest, some are not. Yet the idea itself is a form of rule. The center is watching, the center cares, the center can intervene. Charlemagne also issues written rulings called capitularies. These are collections of instructions that address law, administration, church discipline, economic regulations, and moral expectations. Again, we should not imagine perfect enforcement everywhere, but the effort matters. Writing turns commands into objects that can be copied, carried, read aloud, and referenced later. In a world where people can claim, "I never heard that order," a written text becomes a tool of control. He encourages standardization of coinage and weights, not as an abstract love of order, but because stable exchange binds an empire. If merchants trust the silver coin, if measures of grain are recognized, disputes shrink, commerce becomes easier, the realm becomes more connected. He also becomes deeply involved in the church, because the church is one of the few networks that can reach across the empire. Clergy educate. Clergy keep records. Clergy persuade. Clergy can also challenge rulers if doctrine or morality becomes a battlefield. Charles does not want chaos in the church. He wants unity. This is where the phrase Christian Empire begins to feel real in the West. Charlemagne promotes a vision of Western Christendom, where faith is not a private preference, but a shared public identity. He wants clergy to be educated. He wants liturgy to be consistent. He wants sermons to teach clear doctrine. He wants bishops to behave like disciplined leaders, not like local warlords in clerical clothing. You can see how this vision links directly to the coronation of 800. If Charles is crowned emperor, he is not crowned as the leader of one tribe. He is crowned as the defender and organizer of a Christian order. But the coronation also creates controversy. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire still exists. It is sophisticated, literate, and deeply attached to its claim of being the true Roman Empire. From the Byzantine perspective, crowning a Western emperor looks like a challenge and an insult. And so, a new rivalry grows, not only between political states, but between two claims to Roman legitimacy. For the papacy, the coronation is also a strategic act. Rome needs protection. The city is vulnerable to local factional violence. Italian politics are unstable. The Pope wants a powerful ally. By crowning Charles, the papacy ties him to Rome in a sacred way. At the same time, the act implies that the Pope plays a role in recognizing imperial authority. That implication becomes a seed of later conflict, because emperors will sometimes insist they are above popes, and popes will sometimes insist the opposite. Charlemagne himself may or may not have been surprised by the exact moment, depending on which account you trust, but either way he accepts the title and the responsibility. And once he accepts it, his court begins to look more and more like a center of imperial culture. This is where Aachen enters the story. Aachen is chosen for practical reasons, including its hot springs, but it becomes something bigger, a symbol and a stage. Charlemagne wants a place that can rival the grandeur of other great courts. Buildings become part of governing. They broadcast legitimacy without needing a speech. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen draws on Roman and Byzantine architectural ideas. It is meant to lift the mind toward heaven while also placing the ruler within that heavenly order. When a ruler sits in an elevated position inside such a sacred space, everyone present receives a message. This authority is not only political, it is woven into a divine story. Magnificence, in this world, is not waste, it is a method. It persuades nobles that loyalty is worthwhile. It convinces envoys that this empire is real. It impresses clerics who want order. It shapes memory. And then there is the quieter, more surprising achievement of Charlemagne's reign: learning. We call it the Carolingian Renaissance. But do not picture crowds of artists painting masterpieces in every street. Picture instead a disciplined effort to preserve and improve knowledge in an era where knowledge can easily decay. Picture monasteries copying texts by hand. Picture teachers drilling students in grammar and logic, because a poorly trained priest can distort doctrine, and a poorly trained scribe can ruin a legal text. Picture a ruler who understands that ideas and administration are as important as cavalry. Charlemagne gathers scholars from different regions. One of the most famous is Alcuin of York, a scholar from the British Isles where monastic learning had remained strong. Alcuin becomes a central figure in shaping educational reform at the court. The court encourages schools and monasteries and cathedrals. It promotes a curriculum that draws on the classical liberal arts, adapted for Christian life. The point is not academic vanity. The point is competence. Clergy who can read scripture correctly, administrators who can keep records, and advisors who can help the ruler think clearly. One practical outcome of this movement is a clearer style of handwriting called Carolingian minuscule. This may sound like a small detail until you try to read older manuscripts. Earlier scripts could be cramped, inconsistent, and hard to decipher. Carolingian minuscule uses clearer letter forms, more consistent spacing, and features that improve readability. That matters for learning, it matters for copying, it matters for preserving meaning. In a sense, Charlemagne's cultural reforms recognize a truth that still applies today. If you want knowledge to spread, you must make it legible. You must make it teachable. You must build systems that reduce errors. This manuscript culture also helps preserve older texts. Many Latin works that survive today survive because monasteries copied them. Charlemagne's court becomes a hub where texts are collected, corrected, and redistributed. That does not mean everything is saved. Much is still lost. But the effort strengthens continuity at a moment when continuity is fragile. Charlemagne's personal relationship with learning is also revealing. He is not the stereotype of a scholarly king who writes books in candlelight. He is a practical man who values learning as power. Some sources suggest he struggled with writing and began learning later in life. Whether every detail is accurate or embellished, the broader truth is that he respected educated people and he invested in their work. That investment also had a religious edge. Charlemagne wants a more unified church in the Western lands. He promotes consistent liturgy, modeled on Roman practice. He encourages clergy discipline. He supports the enforcement of tithes in many places, meaning a portion of resources goes to support church life. He wants sermons that teach clear doctrine. In some cases, model sermons are circulated so that even less gifted preachers can deliver something coherent and orthodox. Here you can see an important shift. In earlier centuries, Christianity in different regions could look and feel different. Local customs could be strong. Charlemagne's reforms push Western Europe toward a more standardized Catholic identity. This becomes one of the building blocks of medieval Western Christendom. And yet, even here, reality is complex. Unity can mean stability, but it can also mean pressure and coercion. When faith becomes tied to empire, people who resist are not only different, they become rebellious. That dynamic is one reason religious conflict becomes so intense in medieval politics. Now, step back and consider the daily experience of those living under Charlemagne's rule. In a monastery, a monk might spend hours copying texts, praying at fixed times, and working on the monastery's lands. He might feel the world is becoming more orderly, more connected to the great Christian narrative. In a village far from the court, a peasant family might feel the weight of demands, taxes, labor obligations, military levies, and the fear of raids or war. In a town, a merchant might benefit from safer travel and more reliable currency while still dealing with local disputes and the power of local lords. Charlemagne's rule is not equally experienced. Empires rarely are. Yet he aims to create a framework where, at least in theory, the same ruler's authority is recognized across a vast landscape. His court itself is a moving center of power. Charlemagne travels, holds assemblies, listens to complaints, and distributes rewards. Diplomats come. Gifts arrive. Letters are exchanged. The ruler's presence becomes a kind of gravity that pulls the realm together. There are stories, for example, of exotic gifts. An elephant is one of the most famous. Such a gift is not merely a curiosity. It is a symbol. It says, even distant powers recognize this ruler's status. In an era where most people never travel far from home, the idea of an emperor receiving wonders from afar strengthens the aura of empire. So what kind of man stands at the center of all this? We should not flatten him into a saint or a villain. Medieval sources often praise rulers by making them look ideal, and later national stories often reshape him for their own agendas. But we can draw a portrait with cautious honesty. Charlemagne is energetic and persistent. He is deeply involved in decisions. He values counsel, but expects obedience. He understands the psychology of loyalty and reward. He appreciates learning as a practical tool. He enjoys the prestige of empire. And he is willing to use force, sometimes extreme force, to create unity. He also has the instincts of a symbol maker. He chooses Aachen and builds grand structures. He supports a renaissance of learning. He aligns himself with Rome. He adopts the language of Christian kingship. These are not random choices. They build a narrative that people can believe in. And here's where the coronation comes back again, now with full weight. When the Pope crowns Charlemagne emperor in 800, it is not simply an honor. It is a new story about the West. It says, The West is not merely a shattered afterimage of Rome. The West can claim Rome's legacy, with the Church as a partner. That story reshapes identity for centuries. Later emperors will fight to hold the title. Popes and emperors will argue over who is above whom. Kings will envy imperial prestige. Scholars will look back to the Carolingian Renaissance as a model of reform. Even the very phrase Holy Roman Empire, which becomes common later, owes its existence to the idea that a Western empire has been reborn under a Christian framework. But an empire is not only built, it is inherited. And that is where Charlemagne's story takes a turn that feels familiar in human history. Succession. Charlemagne's reign is long, and long reigns can create an illusion of permanence. People begin to think the order will last because it has lasted through their whole adult lives. Yet once the ruler dies, the system's weaknesses appear. The Frankish tradition of dividing lands among heirs does not vanish simply because the ruler wears an imperial crown. Over time, Charlemagne's descendants struggle with rivalry, ambition, and the challenge of holding diverse regions together. Within a generation, internal conflict intensifies. The empire fractures into parts that develop different political identities. One famous milestone in that process is the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divides the Carolingian realm among three brothers. One part roughly aligns with what will become France. Another aligns with what will become Germany. The middle region, stretching like a corridor through the heart of Europe, becomes difficult to hold together and becomes a long-term zone of contest. Italy follows its own complex path, shaped by regional powers, papal politics, and later outside intervention. Meanwhile, the imperial title eventually becomes more closely associated with the Eastern, Germanic side, especially in later centuries when new dynasties claim to revive and continue the imperial tradition. So if the political unity breaks, why does Charlemagne remain so important? Because the kind of unity he created, cultural, institutional, symbolic, does not disappear as easily as borders. The educational reforms remain influential. Monastic and cathedral schools continue copying texts. The clear handwriting tradition shapes manuscript culture for generations. The idea of a unified Western Christendom under a ruler who defends the church becomes an enduring pattern, even when rulers and church leaders fight over control. And the memory of Charlemagne becomes a resource. Later, rulers use him as a model. They claim continuity with him. They point to his reign to justify their own ambitions. In that way, Charlemagne becomes larger than his life. He becomes a symbol that people fight over, not only with swords, but with stories. This is why you will sometimes hear him called a father of Europe. That phrase can be misleading if it suggests he created modern Europe in a straightforward way, because modern nations and identities form much later. But the phrase points to something real. His reign helped shape the foundations of medieval Western Europe's political imagination. At the same time, it is important to say clearly that foundations are not the same as destiny. Charlemagne's empire did not naturally evolve into modern unity. Europe remains divided, competitive, and often violent for centuries. The unity he built becomes a dream, a claim, a memory, sometimes inspiring, sometimes dangerous. So when someone asks, who was Charlemagne? The shortest answer is that he was a Frankish king crowned emperor in Rome in 800, a conqueror and a ruler who shaped medieval Europe. But the truer answer includes the contradictions. He is a warrior who values learning. He is a reformer who relies on force. He is a patron of manuscripts whose policies help preserve texts that would otherwise be lost. He is an ally of popes, whose coronation triggers centuries of debate about authority. He is a builder of institutions that strengthen central control, and yet his empire still fractures under the weight of succession. If you listen closely, you can hear how his story echoes in later history. Whenever rulers try to unite diverse lands under one authority, they face the same problem Charlemagne faced: distance, local power, cultural difference, and the fragile nature of loyalty. Whenever leaders try to connect political power with moral or religious legitimacy, they face the same tension he lived with. Partnership can turn into rivalry, and unity can demand more coercion than people want to admit. Now, let's return one last time to the Basilica in Rome, to the moment the crown touches his head. In the flickering light, with chanting around him, Charlemagne becomes emperor not because the past returns exactly as it was, but because the West needs a new story. The old Roman world is gone, the new medieval world is forming, and in that moment, those worlds overlap. He does not resurrect the Roman Empire of highways and marble cities. Instead, he creates something new, a Christian empire of oaths, monasteries, royal messengers, and written capitularies, held together by war when necessary and by reform when possible. That is why his reign matters. It is not merely a list of battles. It is a demonstration of how power, faith, learning, and memory can combine to create a civilization's self-image. And it leaves you with a question that is still worth asking today, quietly and honestly. When a powerful leader tries to impose unity on a fractured world, what is the price, and who pays it? Charlemagne's answer was to build, to reform, and to fight. The results shaped Europe for centuries. The costs were also real, written into the lives of people on the frontiers, in the villages, and in the communities forced to choose between resistance and submission. History rarely gives us pure heroes or pure villains. It gives us human beings whose choices create ripples. Charlemagne's ripples became waves. Now, rewind with me, not as a formal break, but by drifting a little farther upstream in the same river of events, because the coronation only makes sense when you have seen how Charles learned to be the kind of ruler who could wear that crown without it sliding off. As a young man in the Frankish elite, Charles would have been trained to ride and fight, yes, but also to sit through long gatherings where powerful men argued, negotiated, and swore oaths. These assemblies were not decorative. They were where authority was performed. A ruler listened, then decided. He rewarded loyalty in public, so everyone could see the benefits of obedience. He corrected or punished in public so everyone could see the risks of defiance. Even silence mattered. If a king allowed a noble's insult to pass without response, he could look weak. If he overreacted, he could look unstable. He had to carry a steady presence, like a weight that keeps a ship from flipping. Charles would also have watched how religion and politics braided together. A bishop could be a spiritual leader, but also a landowner and judge. An abbot could command resources like a noble. A monastery could be a fortress of both prayer and property. When the church supported a ruler, it was not simply blessing, it was partnership. And when the church resisted, it could become a rival center of authority. When Pepin died, the realm was divided between Charles and his brother Carloman. That division is easy to overlook, but it is crucial. In a world where unity is fragile, two brothers ruling side by side can become two magnets pulling the realm in different directions. For a time, cooperation is possible, but tension is never far away. Each brother has his own advisors, each has his own loyal nobles, each makes decisions that can be interpreted as power moves. If either brother appears weaker, the other can attract followers. The realm can begin to lean, not because the people want civil war, but because ambition and fear push them toward the strongest center. Carloman's sudden death removes this problem, but it also creates another. Charles now holds more power than any Frankish ruler in generations, and when a ruler holds that much power, every neighbor watches carefully. Friends wonder whether they will be absorbed. Rivals wonder whether they must strike first. And local elites wonder whether the king will respect their privileges or break them. This is where Charles shows a remarkable instinct. He does not simply sit and wait for threats to come to him. He moves outward to control the pressure points. He treats the frontier not as a line to defend, but as a zone to organize. He creates border regions later called marches, and he expects the officials in those regions to be both governors and military commanders. In modern terms, you could think of the marches as a combination of buffer zones and forward bases. One of those pressure points is the Italian peninsula. The Lombards are powerful, and their presence is a constant anxiety for Rome. When Charles intervenes, he gains more than territory. He gains a new kind of standing. Italy is filled with Roman memory. The roads, the churches, the titles, the language of authority, everything carries prestige. A king who can operate successfully in Italy begins to look less like a tribal war leader and more like an heir to something older. Another pressure point is the northeast, Saxony. Here Charles meets the hardest kind of resistance. Resistance that is not centralized, not easily negotiated away, and deeply tied to local identity. When a single king surrenders, a war can end quickly. When a region is held together by many leaders and local sacred traditions, resistance can return again and again, like a fire that reignites in the wind. It also helps to remember what war looks like in this era. It is not always a clean clash of armies in open fields. It often means raiding, burning, taking livestock, destroying stores of grain, cutting down sacred trees or seizing sacred objects, and targeting leaders. A campaign can be devastating even without a large battle, and the threat of another campaign the next year can pressure communities into submission. This is why oaths matter so much. When a Saxon leader swears loyalty and then rebels, Charles interprets it as a breach that threatens the entire system. In his mind, if broken oaths are tolerated, the realm becomes a patchwork of temporary promises. A king cannot rule that way, so he responds harshly, and the harshness is meant to be a lesson as much as a punishment. The tragedy, of course, is that harshness can also plant deeper hatred, making the next rebellion more likely. Over time, the Saxon Wars end not with one dramatic surrender, but with a gradual tightening of control. Military defeat, political absorption, settlement patterns shifting, and the slow building of church structures that reshape daily life. Conversion, too, becomes layered. Some accept baptism sincerely, some accept it to survive, some resist quietly while older customs fade over generations. What looks like a sudden conversion on paper can be, in real human lives, a long and complicated transition. While these frontier struggles continue, Charlemagne is also building a habit of governance that is unusually organized for his world. His court issues rulings and expects them to be known. His officials keep records more consistently. His envoys travel with authority. And most importantly, he treats the realm as something that can be shaped by policy, not only by personal charisma. Picture two royal envoys arriving in a region far from Aachen. They might be an experienced noble and a respected bishop. They arrive with written instructions. They gather local leaders and listen to complaints. A farmer might accuse a local lordsman of stealing livestock. A monastery might complain that a count has seized land. A widow might claim her inheritance has been ignored. The envoys hear the cases, and then they remind everyone that these disputes are not only local matters, they are matters of the emperor's peace. Even if justice is imperfect, the very act of calling it the emperor's peace reshapes how people imagine authority. Of course, this system is not perfect. Some regions barely feel the envoy's presence. Some officials evade scrutiny. Some local powers remain almost independent. But even imperfect reach changes behavior. The possibility of inspection can restrain abuses. The existence of written rulings can limit how far local courts can drift. The presence of a recognized imperial authority can discourage some kinds of private warfare. Now consider what this means for the church. A bishop who knows the emperor cares about discipline will be more cautious. A priest who knows there are standards will feel pressure to learn, or at least to follow a script. A monastery that receives imperial support will become more stable and influential. Over time, that stability becomes a web across the realm. This web is also why Charlemagne's investment in education is so powerful. He is not funding learning as decoration. He is funding it because the realm needs trained minds. In a world where political order depends on oaths, records, sermons, and legal judgments, literacy is not luxury. It is infrastructure. So, imagine a monastery school. Young clerics learn to read Latin. They practice copying letters and phrases. They learn the rhythms of liturgy. They memorize scripture and prayers. Some will become priests who serve villages. Some will become scribes who copy capitularies. Some will become advisors who write letters in the emperor's name. And as this happens, a more uniform culture of words begins to spread. This is where the handwriting reform becomes more than handwriting. A clear script reduces errors. It reduces misunderstanding. It speeds learning. It makes texts transferable. In a world without printing, every improvement in copying is a multiplication of stability. Now, bring that image back to Aachen. The palace is not only a home, it is a factory of order. It has halls where councils meet, where disputes are judged, where ambassadors are received. It has archives where documents are stored. It has chapels where rituals reinforce the sacred nature of authority. It has workshops where scribes copy manuscripts. It has spaces where the emperor can display generosity. It is the physical form of central power. And then there are the small human moments that help you feel the era. Imagine Charlemagne at a meal with advisors and visiting scholars. The food is heavy, the talk serious. A messenger arrives with news from a frontier. A bishop speaks about the need for stricter discipline among priests. A noble asks for permission to marry into another powerful family. A scholar recommends a correction to a text that has been copied incorrectly for decades. The emperor listens, and in that listening, you can sense how much of his empire depends not only on strength, but on attention. When the Pope crowns him in Rome, then it is not crowning a mere conqueror. It is crowning a ruler who has already been trying to rule like something bigger than a regional king. The title fits the ambition that has been building for years. After 800, the imperial title becomes part of the realm's public language. Letters, ceremonies, and court culture increasingly reflect that. Yet the empire remains medieval in its fundamentals. It is not a modern state with fixed borders and uniform enforcement. It is a living system held together by repeated action, assemblies, travel, campaigns, oaths, rewards, and reforms. Charlemagne's death in 814 tests whether the system can survive without his personal energy. In the short term, the dynasty continues. In the longer term, fractures appear. The division of lands among heirs becomes a pressure that the imperial title cannot fully overcome. Rivalries grow, regions develop distinct identities and interests. The realm's unity becomes contested. And still, the cultural legacy remains stubborn. Schools continue. Monasteries continue copying. The idea of a Western empire remains a powerful dream and a political claim. Later rulers will chase that dream. Some will use it to build order. Others will use it to justify domination. In either case, the shadow of Charlemagne is there. So perhaps the most honest way to describe Charlemagne is this. He is the moment when Western Europe learns to imagine itself as more than a collection of post-Roman fragments. He is not the creator of modern nations, but he helps create the stage on which later European history plays out. He turns power into an institution, and he turns conquest into a claim of moral order. When you hear his name, then, do not only picture a crown on a single head. Picture a network. Frontier forts, marching armies, envoys riding muddy roads, scribes copying by lamplight, bishops debating doctrine, villagers learning new prayers, merchants weighing silver, and an emperor trying, sometimes wisely, sometimes brutally, to make all of it hold together. There is another layer to this story that often stays hidden behind the glitter of the crown, and it is the layer of misunderstanding. Misunderstanding between worlds that both claim to be Roman. In the East, the empire centered on Constantinople still calls itself Roman. Its officials still write in the language of empire. Its court rituals are refined. Its diplomats speak in the voice of centuries. From that vantage point, what happens in Rome in 800 looks not like a revival but like a rupture. How can the Pope declare a new emperor when the Roman Empire never truly ended? How can a Frankish king be called Emperor of the Romans when the Romans, in their eyes, are still ruled from New Rome? This is not a simple argument about pride. It is an argument about legitimacy. In the ancient world, the emperor is not only a military leader. He is a legal and sacred figure who embodies the state. In the Byzantine tradition, that embodiment is continuous. The Western lands may have slipped from direct control, but the idea of imperial continuity remains. In the West, however, people live among ruins and memories. They know the old empire is gone as a practical reality. They also live under threats, raids, local violence, political fragmentation that the distant Eastern emperor cannot reliably solve. For Rome and the papacy, an emperor who cannot protect you is an emperor in name only. So when the Pope crowns Charlemagne, the act says something blunt: the West will not wait for the East. Some later writers connect this moment to the unusual political situation in Byzantium around that time, including the fact that imperial power could be contested and complicated. But even without focusing on specific personalities, the main point stands. The coronation is a statement of independence by the Western Church and Western political elites. It creates a new axis of power centered on Rome and the Frankish realm. And once created, that axis changes everything. It encourages Western rulers to think in imperial terms. It encourages popes to think of themselves as figures who can authorize empire. It encourages the East to defend its claim more fiercely. And it deepens the cultural distance between Greek-speaking Eastern Christianity and Latin-speaking Western Christianity, a distance that will eventually contribute to major religious and political divides. Charlemagne himself navigates this tension with the instincts of a practical ruler. He wants recognition. He wants stability. He also wants to avoid an unnecessary war with the East when his frontiers already demand attention. Diplomatic language becomes careful. Titles are chosen with sensitivity. Alliances are considered. Yet the basic reality remains. There are now two imperial claims, and the West's claim is no longer a fantasy whispered by poets. It has a crowned man behind it, with armies and institutions. This is one reason Aachen matters so much. It is not only a comfortable residence with baths and halls, it is a rival capital in miniature, designed to say, the West has a center now. The old Roman Empire had Rome and later Constantinople. Charlemagne has Aachen, a place that feels both Germanic and Roman, both new and old. Inside that environment, the cultural reforms take on a sharper meaning. Education is not only for better sermons, it is for imperial identity. A ruler who wants to be seen as an emperor needs a court culture that looks and sounds imperial. He needs written law. He needs records. He needs scholars who can write letters with authority and polish. He needs clergy who can speak the language of unity. In other words, the Carolingian Renaissance becomes part of the empire's performance. But the performance also shapes reality. When schools improve, clergy competence improves. When texts are copied more carefully, doctrinal consistency improves. When letters travel with clearer handwriting and more standardized language, administration improves. These are not mere symbols. They are changes that alter how people live and how power functions. Now, consider the man at the center again, not as a statue, but as a human being in a world that never rests. Charlemagne's days would have been filled with decision after decision. Who gets land? Which count is removed? Which monastery is granted protection? Which frontier requires reinforcements? Which dispute must be judged personally to prevent a feud? Which bishop is disciplined for misconduct? Which law must be clarified because local courts interpret it differently? Even the act of moving the court is a political decision, because wherever the emperor goes, resources follow, disputes are heard, favors are granted, and authority becomes visible. He is also a family man in the political sense, and in this era, family is never purely private. Marriages are alliances, children are heirs, and bargaining chips, relatives can be rivals. The household becomes a political institution. That reality affects the court's atmosphere. Every conversation can have consequences. Every invitation can signal favor. Every exclusion can signal danger. When we talk about Charlemagne as a reformer, it is easy to imagine he wakes each morning thinking, "Today I will improve education." But the truth is more likely that he sees education as one lever among many to keep the realm from fracturing. A realm can survive wars and still collapse from internal disorder. If the church is chaotic, it can become a source of rebellion. If local officials abuse power, resentment grows. If law is inconsistent, feuds multiply. If clergy are ignorant, religious confusion can spread like a slow infection through the body of the realm. This is also why the church reforms matter so much. Charlemagne does not see himself as a priest, but he does see himself as a guardian of the church in his realm. He supports councils that address doctrine and discipline. He encourages uniform liturgy, so worship in distant regions feels connected. He expects bishops and abbots to act as responsible leaders. He wants clergy to preach in a way that is understandable and correct, because sermons are one of the few forms of mass communication. And here, there is another tension that makes his reign feel human, the tension between ideal and reality. An emperor can order reforms, but people still behave like people. Some officials follow the rules, some twist them. Some clergy are devoted, some are corrupt, some nobles accept discipline, some plot around it. Charlemagne's greatness is not that he creates a perfect system, but that he pushes hard enough that the system changes direction. Now, one of the most interesting signs of that change is how later Europeans remember the past. After Charlemagne, the idea of the West as a coherent Christian realm becomes stronger. People begin to imagine a shared civilization that is not simply what is left after Rome, but something with its own mission and identity. Monasteries preserve not only religious texts, but also elements of classical learning. Royal courts begin to value literacy more consistently. Law becomes more written and more systematized. The church becomes more standardized. These trends do not originate solely with Charlemagne, but his reign accelerates them, organizes them, and gives them prestige. At the same time, the empire's political fragmentation after his death shows the limits of what one man can do. It is tempting to think of history as a story of great individuals bending the world to their will. Charlemagne complicates that temptation. He is undeniably powerful, yet his system still depends on traditions, on local powers, and on inheritance patterns he cannot erase. His empire is strong, yet it still breaks into parts. This is why his legacy is best understood as a foundation rather than a finished building. He creates frameworks, administrative, cultural, religious, that others inherit, modify, and sometimes weaponize. He also creates a memory, and memory can be as powerful as law. In later centuries, rulers will look back and claim they are reviving Charlemagne's empire. Popes will invoke the authority implied by the coronation. German kings will pursue imperial recognition and struggle over the meaning of Rome. The very phrase empire in the West will carry the echo of that Christmas day in 800. Even conflicts that Charlemagne could never have imagined will be argued with language that his reign helped normalize. So if you want to take one quiet lesson from his life, take this. Power is not only what a ruler does in the moment. Power is also what a ruler leaves behind in institutions and in stories. Charlemagne wins battles, yes. But he also leaves schools, scripts, legal habits, and an imperial idea that outlives him. And the most honest way to listen to this story is to listen with two ears at once. With one ear, hear the ambition, the creativity, the desire to preserve learning and build order. With the other ear, hear the harshness, the coercion, the human suffering on the frontiers, and the pressure that unity can place on diverse communities. That double listening is what keeps history from turning into propaganda. Because if we only praise, we become blind. And if we only condemn, we become shallow. Charlemagne deserves neither worship nor dismissal. He deserves understanding. And understanding begins where we began, in a dim basilica, with a crown, an emperor, and a world that is trying to decide what it will be after the fall of Rome. The crown is placed, the title is spoken, the crowd murmurs, and the future opens. From that moment onward, the West no longer sees itself as merely surviving. It begins to see itself as inheriting, organizing, and claiming. That claim will inspire great achievements and terrible conflicts. It will build cathedrals and burn towns. It will preserve books and wage wars. It will produce saints and tyrants. It will argue endlessly about who has the right to rule in God's name. And all of that, in some small but undeniable way, traces back to Charlemagne Charles the Great, who stood at the crossing point of memory and creation, and who tried to turn a fractured world into something that could be called an empire. If you ever visit places that still carry his footprint, an old cathedral town, a monastery turned into a quiet museum, a ruined fort on a river frontier, listen for the smaller sounds beneath the grand narrative. Picture a messenger arriving at dusk with a sealed letter and mud on his boots, because the emperor's words must reach the edge of the realm before winter closes the roads. Picture a village priest rehearsing his Latin by lamplight so he will not stumble through the prayers on Sunday morning. Those lives are not footnotes. They are what empire means when you strip away ceremony. An empire is not only crowns and borders. It is people learning new habits, repeating new formulas, living under new expectations, and adapting to institutions that slowly change what feels normal. And that is another reason Charlemagne matters. He shows how an idea Rome reborn, unity under faith, order through reform, can travel through ordinary days and leave behind both light and shadow. The light is the preservation of learning, the push toward clearer law, the strengthening of schools, and the building of a shared cultural language. The shadow is the coercion, the suffering on frontiers, and the temptation to confuse unity with righteousness. If we can hold both in our minds, we do not only understand one ruler. We understand the beginnings of the medieval West, and we become better readers of history itself, less easily seduced by simple legends, and more able to see how power shapes culture long after the armies march home and the banners are folded away. Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments